Alright, the following is a collection of news from Patriots. Let's get into the news this Thursday morning. It looks like more and more politicians are leaving the sinking Democrat ship. It's glorious. Now we're seeing a major shift to the right happening of all places inside the bluest of blue cities. We're gonna see the latest party switch happening with the mayor of America's fifth largest city and what the rise of what's called law and order politics means for collapsing the Democrats into a permanent political minority. It is official. The Democrat mayor of the city of Dallas is now officially a Republican in an op-ed of the Wall Street Journal. Mayor Eric Johnson, the mayor of the fifth largest city in the whole of the nation, Dallas, Texas, announced that he is leaving the Democrats and he is switching parties to the Republicans. Johnson wrote, quote, "The future of America's great urban centers depends on the willingness of the nation's mayors to champion law and order and practice fiscal conservatism. Our cities desperately need the genuine commitment to those principles as opposed to the inconsistent poll-driven commitment of many Democrats. That has long been a defining characteristic of the GOP. In other words, American cities need Republicans and Republicans need American cities now." Mayor Johnson's defection actually comes on the heels of another Texas Democrat who just switched parties. Clayburgh County Attorney Kira Talek Sanchez recently announced that she's become a Republican after having served as a Democrat for the last 8 years. Sanchez specifically cited the horrific crisis at the southern borders the rationale for her switch, stating, quote, "There is an unprecedented crisis at our southern border. I believe that the GOP has policies of law and order protecting safety and backing the blue best align with my values and the values of the citizens of Claiborne County. I look forward to working with my colleagues to keep South Texas safe." Now, what's so interesting here is that what both Sanchez and Johnson are doing is actually part of a rather noticeable larger pattern of labor. The Washington Free Beacon just published an astonishing report that found that over the last 20 years, get this, 4 times as many Democratic state lawmakers have switched to the Republican Party than the other way around. All told, 83 Democratic legislators have defected and joined the GOP since 1994. Compared with only 23 Republicans who became Democrats, 5 of those blue to red switches happened just this year alone. But you'll notice, too, that we're seeing a theme emerge here with these 2 defections, aren't we? Both of these former Democrats pointed to the fact that the Democrat Party is increasingly seen as the party most responsible for the breakdown of law and order, while the GOP is associated with the party that will restore law and order. So law and order are becoming defining characteristics for this campaign. And what we're going to see here is that it may in fact end up permanently consigning the Democrats to a minority party for the foreseeable future. The last video that I made on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the meltdown that she was having over the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action and BTFO student loan forgiveness. Definitely don't send this basic census data to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Twitter, because you might just designate her entire worldview holy frickin' moly. You know, it's crazy how somebody can tweet something in such a self-righteous manner as if it's something we should all be outraged over. But anybody with 2 working brain cells and basic understanding of demographics takes a look at the tweet eggs, look at the numbers that she's posting, and can instantly put 2 and 2 together and come to the conclusion that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, well, let's just say, isn't the brightest light bulb. You guys are gonna believe this? I honestly cannot believe that these people are real. Alright folks, your typical leftist talking point. It sounds good. It sounds like injustice. It sounds like they're fighting for something that's righteous. But like usual, it ends up being downright stupid. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweets as SCOTUS was serious about their ludicrous colorblindness claims they would have abolished legacy admissions, aka affirmative action, for the privileged 70% of Harvard's legacy applicants are white. SCOTUS didn't touch that, which would have impacted them in their patrons and of course, social justice warriors on Twitter eating this up. But instantly as I read this tweet, and probably you guys are on the same page as me, we probably shared a very similar reaction. Well, I don't know, this number seems to check out from their perspective. 70% of Harvard legacy applicants are white. The horror, all the legacy applicants experiencing this extreme form of privilege having a leg up in the application process. 70% of them are white, the horror, it's an injustice until of course, You realize, well, isn't roughly 70% of the population white? Little Google search population percentage USA, enter white Americans or Americans who identify. This group constitutes the majority of people in the United States. According to the 2020 census, 71% or 235 million people were white alone or in combination, and 61.6%, 204 million people were white alone, as represented. A national white demographic decline from 72.4% white alone share of the U.S. population in 2010. Well, would you look at that? It seems as though even within the world of extreme privilege and nepotism, in the world of Harvard's legacy admissions, or at least the applications themselves, the race split is totally representative of the actual population of the country. I mean, what are we fighting here? Now? Honestly, I don't know exactly where I stand when it comes to legacy applications. I find for the most part, it's a distraction, not exactly sure that it's unconstitutional in the same way that race-based admissions would be. You know, these colleges and universities are private entities. They have societal and financial connections to families, you know, long-standing Harvard family legacies. If these schools want to give those people beneficial treatment as a meritocratic, is it fair? Maybe not. But it certainly isn't race-based discrimination. The whole thing is a distraction. And it's such a dumb distraction. It's such a poorly thought out distraction. Left boys aren't making the point that they think they're making. Oh, the horror. They're trying to claim that legacy admissions are, I guess, a form of white privilege? When it seems totally fair to me, I'd like to see the rest of the racial split, to be completely honest. How many of those people are Asian, Black, Hispanic? It's the perfect representation of left-wing thinking, identifying problems where problems don't actually exist, and being total, complete, utter hypocrites in the process. Here's a beautiful meme. Everyone should be treated equally. Okay, well, then schools can no longer use race as a factor in their admission policies. No, not like that. Don't you see that white privilege is a thing, and that 70% of legacy admissions or legacy applicants are white? 70%. While you don't say you mean exactly correlating with the racial population percentage of white people, how dare you? This is all wrong. Out there as you have stolen my dreams. I don't get what point that these leftovers are trying to make. What's the argument here? That you're outraged that white people are applying to top colleges and universities. You might even argue that these people are racist. The way these leftists mercilessly go after white people, try to demonize white people in the most disingenuous way that you could possibly imagine. It's simply disgusting, because you know, as I always say, if you simply change the word white for black, well, then all of a sudden, you could just imagine the outrage. These left boys are completely out of control. They're completely out of their minds. They're ignorant of the basic facts, and they're frankly hateful. And speaking of these leftovers being out of their mind, especially on this issue, not only are they now demonizing white people for simply being represented in what seems to me in perfectly egalitarian manner, their rhetoric now targeting the Supreme Court is equally as crazy. AOC is calling to subpoena and impeach Supreme Court justices. Everyone listen to this. Ethics guidelines, where we see members of Congress, where we see members of the Supreme Court potentially breaking the law, as we saw in the refusal, with Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from cases implicating his wife, and in January 6th, there also must be impeachment on the table. We have a broad level of tools to deal with misconduct, overreach, and abuse of power. And the Supreme Court has not been receiving the adequate oversight necessary in order to preserve their own legitimacy. And in the process, they themselves have been destroying the legitimacy of the court, which is profoundly dangerous for our entire democracy. Okay, folks. Here's a former Obama aide pushing for structural reform, aka court packing of SCOTUS. Let's take a listen. Great question. So I do think that he should consider structural reform of the court. What we've seen in the last week in the Supreme Court decisions have been a rollback of our constitutional rights and protections, and a rollback of adherence to precedent. We have a Supreme Court that has functionally gone broke when it comes to our constitutional protection. Okay, the Supreme Court has gone rogue. We need to pack the Supreme Court. We need to impeach Justice Thomas and subpoena the rest of these rogue actors. For what? For simply upholding the Constitution as it was written, for ending racism, actual systemic racism within college admissions. We need to tear down legacy applications. Why? Because they're perfectly representative of the actual population. I don't get it. And it all comes back to the same point. It's just so difficult to have a conversation with these people because they're living on a different planet, a planet of make-believe. They see racism where it doesn't exist. They see injustice where it doesn't exist. They're jealous, vengeful, spiteful, angry, miserable. And then they have public officials and thought leaders and celebrities like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez taking advantage of it and grifting in the most manipulative way imaginable. Thank you for watching the video. I wish you a good. I'm already all in on Donald Trump. He's been my guy since 2016. It ain't changing anytime soon. I mean, something big would have to change for me to change my perspective and all of a sudden start supporting neocons and the establishment status quo. I've already made up my mind. I'm shilling for Trump. I don't care what anyone has to say. You know, it's basic freedom of expression and speech. That's my opinion, and I'm gonna use my platform to scream it from the mountaintops. What I'm trying to say is that I'm locked in. You don't need to work overtime to further convince me that I'm making the right choice. Okay, CNN, the choice has already been made. Obviously, I'm being a little bit sarcastic. But as the leftist mainstream media panic continues, they keep trying something new. Every week is a new narrative relating to Donald Trump. And this week's has to be the most pathetic. Well, actually, it's kind of a real attempt at a previous strategy that they've tried before. And it just isn't convincing anyone. Why, you ask? Well, because they're trying to make Donald Trump seem scary by promoting what I'd say is arguably his strongest point. Real spooky, extremist stuff, folks. The newest report is that Trump is supposedly out for revenge, and I'm not exactly convinced, at least not yet. That's a bad thing. Alright, folks. So this week's narrative is similar to a narrative that spawned, I think, maybe roughly 3 weeks to a month ago. Trump wants his enemies to fear. Fourth hair lie use writes Eric Levitz at the Intelligence, or you say, and there seems to be no sign of intelligent life anyway. Last Friday, the Republican Party's presidential frontrunner suggested that America's top generals, quote, deserve to perish. In a post on Truth Social, Donald Trump accused Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley of committing treason, an act so egregious that in times gone by the punishment would have been death. Specifically, Trump wrote that Mark Milley had been dealing with China to give them a heads up on the thinking of the President of the United States and that this treasonous act could have triggered a war between the two countries. The ex-president was seemingly referring to a report that Milley had called his Chinese counterpart shortly before the 2020 election, and after the January 6 insurrection, to assure him that the United States was stable and that Trump would not be ordering any attack against China on his way out the door. Given that this accurately conveyed the administration's posture that the U.S. had no interest in tricking a nuclear weapons state into believing that America was bound to attack, it's difficult to see how Milley's call would have constituted treason. Alright, so that's a very left-wing framing of the situation. The point that Trump is making is that Mark Milley, who answers directly to the president not only on this occasion, but on multiple occasions, went behind Donald Trump's back, I guess you could say subverted the direct military chain of command and essentially did his own thing without the president's permission. And Trump was making the point that essentially the guy had gone rogue and that could be perceived as treasonous. You know, that's a debate for another time. It's a discussion for another time, but these left-wing hags are reframing the situation for their ridiculous little clickbait headlines, attempting to promote this bogus narrative that Donald Trump is, in a way, threatening Mark Milley's life. I mean, it is completely preposterous. The pearl clutches in the media are attempting to promote this narrative. And this is some big news. So what on earth is going on with the crooked Katie Hobbs? Things have gotten even more ridiculous and frankly mysterious. With this utterly corrupt and degraded Arizona governor as the Republicans have taken over power. We're going to see the latest bombshell with this fraud governor and what it all means for our politics as a whole. It's now being widely reported that Katie Hobbs, the former Secretary of State of Arizona, now turned fraud governor. After putting herself in charge of counting her opponents' votes, she's officially stepped down as governor. It is being reported as a temporary disappearance on HubSpot. And no reason has been given for the departure, even how long her leave of absence will be. It's extremely bizarre and mysterious. In her place, a Republican Arizona treasurer, Kimberly Yee, has taken over as acting governor. And again, you can see in the legacy media continues to shill as propagandists for Democrats, and power reports are coming out that use assuming gubernatorial power, quote, for just a few hours. That's it. There's nothing to see here. Folks, move on, move on. Katie Hobbs has stepped down now, apparently for just a few hours. Really? For how long? Exactly? Is she stepping down? Well, we don't know. We don't have the information as on an as-needed basis. So you don't know for how long, but you just told us it. And why is she stepping down? I told you we don't know. Move on, you racist insurrectionists. So you made the announcement via Twitter. And interestingly enough, already, this acting now Republican governor of Arizona, she's already making some waves. She's actually banned 2 of Ham's appointees from official government meetings, refusing to acknowledge any legitimate authority on their part. It's actually fascinating. The incident vaults to executive deputy directors, and who's now acting governor, is basically refusing to recognize their authority, that they have any authority in the Arizona government, so she banned them from an official government meeting now. For her part is background here. Hobbs has been running in one roadblock after another with a Republican-dominated legislature in Arizona in terms of getting her radical leftist appointees confirmed, and he is just continuing to extend that much-deserved obstruction. The Hobbs governorship at this point has been an abject disaster, as we all knew it would be. She's just basically consigned herself to becoming the veto governor. She's vetoed more bills than any Arizona governor in their state's history. Again, Arizona is dominated by Republican legislation, so Hobbs has just been reduced to she's reduced herself to a total obstructionist at this point. She's an obstructionist with the border security. She's obstructionists with banning CRT in classrooms. She's just an obstructionist at this point. But all of this, of course, begs the question, what are you doing about this? Are you ready to stand up and join the resistance? Because I'm leading a group of dedicated, courageous patriots who can lead a spearhead into the heart of the secular globalist establishment. We punish Bud Light and Target. We've driven CNN in the legacy media near bankruptcy. We forced BlackRock to backtrack on ESG. We've even seen our glorious Trump-appointed Supreme Court ending affirmative action and protecting religious liberty. What's really going on here is that Katie Hobbs stepping down has only served to delegitimize her already suspect tenure as governor, and she only has herself to blame for that. If the very process by which Hobbs assumed office was suspect, then her entire legitimacy of tenure is tainted. She herself, in refusing to recuse herself from overseeing the 2022 election, Secretary of State, thereby placing herself in charge of counting her opponent's votes, Hobbs has inescapably undermined the total legitimacy of her administration. And again, this isn't rocket science. Anyone could have told her that this was going to happen. And that's because the stability of any government rests on a concept that sociologist Max Weber referred to as legitimation. So for Weber, the only way a government can flourish apart from just sheer totalitarianism, the only way a government long-term can flourish is if it convinces the masses that it's worthy of their trust, that officials govern on behalf of the general welfare, that the powers that be are genuinely concerned about the public good and the good of the people. The moment the government is seen as corrupt and fraudulent and protective of the interests of the rich and the powerful and the elite, that government goes through a process known as delegitimation. And stability, the government begins to falter. All you have to do, just ask the Soviet Union or the Berlin Wall. What happens when enough people see the government as incurably corrupt? What's happening today is that delegitimation is spiraling out of control. Every single poll out there has shown an absolute implosion in trust in all our public institutions, government, military, police, banks, schools, universities, across the board. Americans in larger numbers than ever do not trust our public institutions, and that distrust, that legitimation is spinning out of control. The media can't control, politicians can't control it. Courts can't control it. Indictments can't control it. And it's not just here, we're seeing it happen in Europe as well. There is a massive populist uprising on both the left and the right that's ready to throw this entire permanent political class overboard. Katie Hobbs stepping down without explanation, without any hint as to why. You peasants don't need to know. Right, and you don't need to know for how long either. You don't need to know anything about it. It only serves to further delegitimize our government institutions. And again, given that Hobbs came to power under such strange and suspicious circumstances, in the end, she only has herself to blame. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Open Source News. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so